Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Customer Discovery for Agricultural Startups. I'm Sarah Bennett with Nebraska Business Development Center. We'll be moderating part of this and answering questions, but this morning I'm going to be introducing to you our presenter for this morning. So let's go ahead and get started. So customer discovery is part of a series of events this summer that Nebraska Business Development Center is hosting. We have put together these events specifically for agricultural innovators to help individuals that have technologies specifically aimed at helping the agricultural industry or rural development, and to get those innovations and those startup ideas off the ground, and help whether they're seeking funding through the Small Business Innovation Research program, specifically with the USDA, or if folks are considering other pitch opportunities, want to make sure that they are fully prepared. So we've had several events, and we have a link that I'll show you at the end of this presentation up on our website with previous webinars and things that are recorded, as well as opportunities for you to engage with us. Some project management courses if you are pursuing federal research funding to keep you on track, and to make sure you're prepared to pursue specifically the SBIR program with USDA. So thank you for joining us. We will ask that you do mute your microphones. This is set up as a Zoom meeting as opposed to a Zoom webinar, because we will have some interaction opportunities coming up. So we want to visit with you, and we want to see your faces and things like that. Just when Nick is presenting, I'll have you just go ahead and mute your microphones. As we go through, you can ask questions or share your questions or share your comments in the chat. The chat button is at the bottom of your screen. And then you're welcome to go ahead and unmute and share your comments verbally when the presenter asks for attendee input. For your information, we are recording today's workshop, and we're going to make that video recording available within the next day or two. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Nick Brozović. He is the Director of Policy with the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, and thank you, Sarah. Our goal today is to give you an overview of some of the techniques of customer discovery. We'd like to make our short time together as engaging and interactive as possible. This means we'll use the chat as well as the video features of our meeting. So let's start with a quick warm-up. I'd like you to open up your chat boxes in the Zoom meeting screen and answer some quick questions for me. First, who are you? Please type your answer in the chat window, and I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. If you haven't already answered it, what's your company? Again, please type and send us your answer. And Sarah, I guess if I can ask you to move to the next slide, that would be great. Perfect, thank you, Michelle, Lorena. And finally, I'd like to ask, how many customers have you talked with in the last 3 months? Here you can just type a number, and it can be approximate, and send it to us, and we'll find that this will really help us later. Great. Well, thank you so much. So, many of us recognize that most startups fail. That's obviously not great news. However, one of the tenets of entrepreneurship is to be able to learn from failure. The figure I've put up shows the results of an analysis of the top 10 reasons why startups fail. What do you see? Please feel free to type your comments in the chat box, and the questions will get harder as we go, so you can build up some good karma here. I'll give you a few moments to look at the figure and write down what you see, and then based on what we see in the chat, we'll respond to that. Well, you're all a very talkative bunch this morning. So what's the key message here? The largest insight here, and the largest reason why startups fail, is that they build something that nobody wants. So most startups fail because they build something that they can't sell to people because it's not needed. That's pretty basic, don't you think? So if we want to avoid the trap of most startups, we shouldn't spend our time, money, and effort building stuff that no one wants. How might we do that? This is where customer discovery comes in. Customer discovery is an approach and a set of tools that tries to help startups understand what people's needs are very early in the business process. It was pioneered by Steve Blank, a serial entrepreneur and business professor at Berkeley and Stanford. He coined the phrase, "get out of the building," meaning that you can't learn what people need if you don't talk with them. This phrase has something of a different resonance right now, as many of us are literally stuck in the building or the bedroom or the basement. However, because of technology, we can still reach out to potential customers and learn from them if we put our minds to it. Again, for my own information, if you're familiar with customer discovery, please type a yes in the chat window. If it's new to you, please type a no. And customer discovery is closely linked to the concept of the business model canvas and lean startup, which you may also be familiar with. Great, thank you for sharing that. So, program managers at the National Science Foundation were really taken with the potential of customer discovery as a transformative tool for the commercialization of early stage research coming from universities. They set up several curricula to teach customer discovery. Over the last 10 years, these have been rolled out in various ways across the country. It's been a very successful program. In fact, a lot of the material I'll use today comes directly from that curriculum. So why should you care about any of this? I can give you two reasons. First, my own experience is that using customer discovery regularly is a great way to learn quickly about what people's needs are, as well as just how much I currently misunderstand those needs. I haven't found any other way to learn as quickly about customer segments, value propositions, product market fit, and business models in general. Second, today's seminar is part of the Nebraska Business Development Center's series of events to help agricultural startups become more competitive for SBIR funding. Federal funding programs for entrepreneurs have all taken on board the language and philosophy of customer discovery. Understanding and applying these tools correctly and showing that you can do so should make you more competitive for the grants you apply for, as well as being better prepared to talk with investors. You can think of today as a quick introduction. We'll share links to more in-depth resources at the end of the presentation. You should also feel free to reach out to us at any point. We'd love to continue the conversation. We'll start with a short video, just under 6 minutes long, of Steve Blank, in which he explains his views of customer discovery.
All right, so now you're ready to get outside the building. Now, as I said, the things you're looking for are either in-person interviews or Skype conversations or Google Hangout. And so what you're looking to do inside an interview is first introduce yourself. Why are you here? What are you looking for? And I have to tell you that these discovery interviews are really sometimes very disconcerting, particularly in large companies where they can't believe you don't want to sell them something. In fact, they're kind of looking around for, where's the product, where's the demo, where's the PowerPoint? And so therefore it's kind of helpful to explain, listen, I'm happy to try to sell you something, but I'm really here to listen to you because I'm trying to understand how your business works and potentially how can I make it better. So setting that scene both in phone calls or emails and when you set up the meeting, or else you might end up with 15 people in a boardroom expecting a major presentation. You want to make these as casual as you can make them. And in fact, if you're going into large companies, instead of meeting in someone's office, meeting in the cafeteria or taking them out for coffee, kind of reduces the formal, give me the presentation style that people tend to expect. So one of the great questions in trying to get these interviews and get these meetings is, there's just 3 of us. Why would they even take a meeting? And there's a couple ways to do that. Number one is if you're a venture-funded company, you could always drop the names of your VC firm and your advisors, and you have this cloud of whatever, and people are impressed, and that's great. And if you're the 0.001% of the startups in the world, then you don't have this problem. But what if there really are 3 of you, and this is before you've raised any money? Well, instead of telling people that you're there and they ought to take the meeting because you're important, you need to convince them that they want the meeting because you think they're important. And for most human beings, hearing and understanding that someone wants to listen to them talk about their industry or their business actually pushes a button that doesn't get pushed most of the time in a company. Particularly if you remember, I suggested you start with mid-level management rather than the top of the organization. A lot of mid-level managers never get asked for their opinion at all. And so if you make this clear that I'm not here to sell you, I've actually heard that you were pretty smart and you understand a lot about how your department works or your company works or your technology works, I'm really trying to learn. And typically, I suggest to startups that you're really honest, that we're really trying to learn about whether what we're building is what we think we have here, which is something that will radically change your job, your company, and your industry. When you first start discovery, you'll probably be like me when I first started. I actually would go in and hold the list of questions to myself, going down the list, making sure I asked all the questions the same way to all the customers. But after you get more comfortable in discovery, it becomes a lot more fun. Because this time, you'll let the conversation flow where it's going to go, making sure you cover the key parts about tell me about your company and tell me about how you do your job and what kind of pricing, but you won't be so rigid about what order you ask them. And that's when some of the interesting things come out is a potential customer might say, yeah, this is kind of important. And after you've asked this question a lot, you might say, yeah, but it looks like you're trying to tell me something else. Yeah, well, listen, it doesn't seem like you guys are solving anything like this, but boy, if you could solve this problem, we'd pay $1 million for that. Let me tell you, $1 million, you got my attention. What is that problem? That's a great way to eventually let the conversations go where they want to go. 90% of the time, that was a waste of time. But it's that 10% that you're looking for that turns Groupon from the pizza company into the $1 billion company, or ODO into Twitter. Those are the insights you're looking for. So one other thought about getting out of the building in these interviews is, if you're an engineer, it's really easy to understand and ask all the technical questions. But what you're really trying to train yourself to listen for is those market and customer and industry insights that, gee, too bad you're not doing X because the competitors today don't do that. Or too bad, you're not doing X. Or maybe, holy cow, you guys do X? And you were thinking it was about the top 12 features and they're talking about that you have a great UI. Wow, that's something you never would have understood back in the building where you were coding. And that's the intent of getting out of the building and talking to customers. So one of the interesting questions is, should you record the interviews? That is, should you use some kind of electronic media? Should you bring a camera? Should you, start taking notes? One of the best ways to record an interview is not only pencil and paper, but I always put a portable device on the desk and ask permission, of course, of whether you could record the interaction. And when the interview's done, I ask the customer permission to take their picture of either them or outside their office or something interesting in their company or their house or whatever, because it actually puts a face to the notes.
Obviously, there was an enormous amount of information in that video, and there's no test at the end of this workshop. I'd like to talk a lot about discovery that Steve Blank talked about. Pre-planning, the interview itself, and analysis and insight. Here, I'm borrowing from the work of Gift Constable, and again, we'll provide a link to the material at the end. Let's start with pre-planning. When you're doing customer discovery, it's really important to only talk to one person at a time. Focus groups are not a good way to collect this kind of customer information. They're subject to groupthink, and the participants are easily distracted. If you want, you can have someone with you to take notes. It can be nice to have a note taker, and it allows you to focus entirely on the conversation. Numbers 2 and 3 on this list are different aspects of the same thing, so I'll deal with them together. It's important for you to know why you're having the conversation. Have your assumptions and learning goals prioritized ahead of time. Decide on the kinds of people you want to talk with and target interviewees accordingly. Prep your basic flow and list of questions. You might veer off the plan or adapt based on what you hear, which is fine, but you should be prepared. As you prepare, it's also important to be clear on what kind of answers you're hoping to get. You should distinguish learning about a customer's needs, behaviors, and mindset from getting direct feedback about your product or idea. Don't mix these two things up in the discussion flow or it'll get confusing. You should put behavior and mindset first. Be ready to keep your interviewee focused on if they have a problem, how they think about the problem, and if and how they've tried to solve it in the past. Finally, prepare yourself to hear things that are uncomfortable. If you don't do this, you might find yourself selling or convincing, or even hearing what you want to hear. This is called confirmation bias, and we're all very susceptible to it. Your initial goal should be learning. Now, we'll give you a chance to put some of this into practice. This slide shows one of our Water for Food teams out in the field in western Nebraska doing some customer discovery with a natural resources district on their needs around water use monitoring for groundwater pumping. We're going to have a very short discussion on pre-planning for customer discovery. First of all, I have a couple of questions I'd like you to answer in the chat window, and then we can discuss what people wrote. First, who are your customers? While we wait for people to put their answers in the chat box, I can give you the follow-up question too. Once you've defined your customers, how might you frame the overall customer discovery conversation? In other words, you could use something like, I'm curious to learn about, or I'm interested to learn your opinions about. So I'll give you a minute or so to write your thoughts here. And again, it looks like we're having some answers come in, so thank you those that are able to share that with the group. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Conchetta. I'll just give people another minute and then we can have a discussion there. So let me summarize the answers we got. We actually got the first answer from MBDC itself. MBDC's customers are entrepreneurs and researchers. We have an answer that says hemp farmers and CBD product developers, and then healthcare providers and associated labs, as well as individuals. And then finally, established and new businesses in the region. So thank you all for adding those comments. That's a very broad set of groups, both in the agriculture and broader healthcare and business fields. Next, we can think about some slightly more complicated issues. If you find a topic that you're interested to dig deeper into, how might you frame those questions? So I'm going to give you some prompts, and then hopefully you can think about specifically the customers that you have. And if you feel like sharing in the chat window, that would be great. So for example, how might you frame a question around thinking about your challenges or unmet needs? As an example, you can try a sentence that starts with, tell me a little bit about your challenges around or your experiences with problem X. A second way of framing a deeper question is to think about the assumptions or hypotheses you'd like to test. And for this, you can frame questions a little bit like, tell me a little about what's important to you around X. So Josh just said a question. Tell me a little bit about your challenges raising capital. Again, this is a great example. NBDC's goal is to help entrepreneurs and small businesses in Nebraska. And so one of their goals is to use customer discovery to understand how startups might be able to better access capital. And understanding what those challenges are from the company's perspective is very important to NBDC in determining its progress. Thank you, Josh. Well, let's move on to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit in particular about the challenges that agricultural startups have in the pre-planning phase. One thing we hear quite often from agricultural startups is how hard it is to connect with their customers, particularly if the startup is in a city and the customers are predominantly in rural areas. And in fact, some of the questions that are appearing in the chat now go directly to this challenge. So what are some of the strategies that we might use if we want to connect with potential customers in rural areas? I'll give people about 30 seconds to type answers, and then we can jump into a discussion there. Thank you. So we've actually had some great suggestions here. So for connecting into rural areas, good strategies include asking your friends and family, people who work for university extension, for commodity boards, for trade associations. We've also had the comment Facebook, and this is an important comment. Don't be afraid to use social media. Social media can be a great way to reach customers for customer discovery. The key thing is you must frame your ask as curiosity and not selling. So if you reach out to social media and people think that you're selling something, that is unlikely to get you good customer discovery. But we've talked to a number of companies that have approached Facebook and Twitter from a place of curiosity that they want to learn about their customers' problems. And that has worked very well for them, and they found that people are willing to help. It's also very important to know your customers. So if you work with growers, they typically don't want to talk to you in the morning because they're very busy. And this overturns something that many of us are taught, that the best time to talk to somebody is first thing in the morning. Well, if you're trying to reach farmers, they typically don't want to talk to you first thing in the morning because they're very busy. It's much better to set up contacts with them in the late afternoon or evening. Now, the second issue that we come up with is, well, look, this all seems like a lot of work. Couldn't I just do a survey with Google Forms and get a lot of information that way? And before you jump on, I'll say, this is just a trick question to make sure you're paying attention. The answer is no. Same answer for SurveyMonkey, email, and similar impersonal methods. The quality of the information you'll get from an online survey is nothing like what you'll get from proper customer discovery. And in the worst case, it may actually limit your ability to interact with some of those interviewees in the future because it'll annoy them. And then finally, what about COVID-19? So obviously the way we connect has changed radically over the last few months. 6 months ago, I would have said that it's important to go and meet people where they are, in the field, in the equipment dealership, or wherever the customer is. My own experience over the last few months is that customer discovery hasn't been hard remotely, and it's been very nice to not have the travel time and cost involved with going out into the field to talk with people. And so what I'd really say is the implications of COVID-19 on customer discovery may be sector and context specific, but certainly for some sectors and contexts, It's easier than it was. For others, we might expect it to be harder. So if any of you are willing to share your experiences over the last few months, we're really interested to hear. Have you found it easier or harder to connect with people that you want to? Please do let us know in the chat window. Yeah, so it looks like there's a consistent answer here that in general, it's certainly become less expensive and probably easier to connect. So I'll say that's been an interesting thing for me. I didn't expect that, but I think that's a very nice, it's nice that customer discovery can continue at the same cadence as before. And in some cases, it's easier, particularly to get to more senior people than it was before. So we're about halfway into our workshop now, and we're going to switch now to make sure that you get as much as possible from your interviews. So what are some of the things to watch out for during the interview itself? First of all, people are trained to be polite with you. So you need to make them feel safe to give their true opinions rather than what they think you want to hear. This is a very tricky thing, but what we'd recommend is that you ask them up front to be honest with you, and that this is the very best way they can help you. And this is something that I think comes with practice, and not everybody is actually willing to give you brutally honest feedback. Next, don't ask too many yes or no questions, or questions that you can answer with one or a few words. For example, try to avoid questions like, do you grow corn? Or who's your seed dealer? It's better to ask open-ended questions like, tell me a little about your experience with purchasing inputs. And sometimes, of course, it's hard not to ask a yes or a no question, but always follow up with an open-ended question like, why? Or tell me more about that experience. Next, people love to talk about features and solutions of products. When you're in learning mode, don't let that dominate the conversation. Try to keep things factual. Get them to tell you stories about how they previously experienced a problem, if they tried to solve it, or why not, and what happened. Get them to tell you stories about using other products that are in the same domain space as yours. You do want to dive into their emotions, but you can trust a discussion of historical emotions much more than one speculating about what ifs. And then finally, try to shut up as much as possible. Try to keep your questions short and unbiased. Don't embed the answer you want to hear into the question. Don't rush to fill the space when the customer pauses, because they might be thinking or have more to say. And finally, make sure you're learning, not selling. So one of the comments I get quite often goes something like this. Nick, we've spent all this time working on a new and disruptive product. When we talk to a customer, it's important for us to explain it to them first. Without that, the customer has no context for conversation, and their feedback just isn't useful for us. So what do you think about this statement? Is this something that you've thought or done? And in fact, this thought and done. And is this kind of approach part of customer discovery? So let me ask that as a question in the chat window. Is it part of customer discovery to lead with the product and why it's new and disruptive and where it fits into the framing of the conversation? And you can answer with a yes or no. Yeah, and so there's a theme emerging in the answers. It seems counterproductive. You've biased your product. Maybe they don't want that. So what do you think might happen if you try this approach? Let's look at a video where an interviewer tries to lead with talking about the product, and then we'll come back and discuss it.
Thank you for joining me today. I've got actually a very cool product that I've been working on. We're actually able to grow cancer cells, metastasized cancer cells in culture. I wanted to show you some slides on it if I could. Sure. So as you can see here, we've been growing some prostate metastatic cancer cells with proven metastasis to the bone.
And you can see what staging is this?
This is stage. So what did you think? Are you interested in buying this?
It's very interesting, but I just don't see the value for us right now. It's a little too early, but thank you anyways.
So what happened there? And is that what you expected? Again, please feel free to put your comments in the chat window. Yeah, that's right. The interviewer went straight into sales mode, so this wasn't truly a discovery interview. In the sense of how much useful information did the interviewer get in this case? He gave a lot of information. We can argue about whether it was the right information or not, but in terms of what he got back, not so much. Yeah, so again, Josh here has said he was not responsive to the customer. So in this sense, he answered the customer's questions, but those questions were framed very narrowly around the product and its features. And that very much is not customer discovery. So, and he gave up too easily. Yeah, I mean, this is, Dave, this is a great comment that you made. You've only got a limited amount of time with your interviewees and your customers. And so in a sense, you have to use the time wisely. And once he had gone down the rabbit hole of describing the product and the features, it gets a little tough. So let's look now at an interaction with the same people, but a different framing for the conversation.
Thank you for joining me today. I've got actually a very... As I mentioned on the phone, we're working on something that is very cool, and I think you'll find very interesting. But before we get into that, I really don't know much about the types of research that you're doing and where this might fit into it. So I really want to ask you some questions about the job that you're doing, the research that you're doing, how you're using in vitro platforms, and where cells integrate into that.
Sure.
So maybe just to start with, could you tell me a little bit about the research that you're doing here?
Yeah. So I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Excel. We're basically looking at tumor cells. What we do is we take the tumor biopsy and then we try to culture individual cells on petri dishes.
Right. So could you tell me a little bit about some of the challenges that you've encountered, maybe in particular with in vitro systems?
Yeah, the cell-based assays are quite poor. A lot of the experiments are quite challenging.
Great. And could you talk a little bit more about maybe some unmet needs that you have with regard to cell-based models in particular?
Yeah, and we talked about this. I think one of the biggest sort of pain points for us is handling of the cells. We would really like a lot of cells. The ability to sort of grow up these cells would be very, very appealing.
What else should I have asked you today?
Well, that's... I think the key thing is a lot of researchers really want to get access to preclinical specimens. And so if you have the ability to guarantee that these cells are plastic in their behavior, I think that would be extremely powerful.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
So how is that interview and outcome different? Obviously, the product is the same after all. If you have any thoughts, please put them in the chat window. And Dave, thank you for jumping on. Yeah, people love to talk about themselves and their work. What else should I have asked you today? You'll see we'll come back to that theme. But in general, the framing of this conversation was very, very different. The cadence of it was very different. And in this case, the interviewer learned quite a lot about the interviewee's needs and in fact, the whole segment's needs that they might not have stumbled on if they hadn't taken this approach. And overall, very much a positive interaction there. So, Sarah, can we go to the next slide, please? When you're in the middle of an interview, what are some of the ways you can make the most of the time you have with the person you're talking with? Well, first of all, anytime you hear something that doesn't seem right, drill down with follow-up questions. Don't be afraid to ask for clarification and the why behind the what. You can even try drilling into multiple layers of why, as long as the interviewee doesn't start getting annoyed. For important topics, try repeating back what the person said. You can occasionally get interesting results through this. The interviewee may correct you because you've misinterpreted what they said, or by hearing their own thoughts, they'll actually realize that their true opinion is slightly different, and they'll give you a second, more sophisticated answer. At the end of every interview, see if you can get leads to another 1 to 3 people to talk to. In an agricultural setting, though you might start with friends and family, it's important to quickly move away to talking with people that you don't know who can provide you with genuine feedback. Let's talk about some of the particular challenges you might find around digging deeper when you're an agricultural startup. Now, we could fill a whole hour just with these. I've picked 3 that are quite common, and of course, if you have others, please do put them in the chat window as we go, and either we can talk about them at the end if there's time, or we can reach out to you afterwards to learn more. So, first, are you hearing polite interest or pain? This is one that Steve Blank really emphasizes in his materials. Hearing someone express interest in what you're doing is not a strong validation. And based on what you've heard, why do you think this is? If you have thoughts, please do put them in chat. I'll give you a few moments and then continue. Again, as we heard earlier, people tend to be quite polite, and they'll tend to tell you what they think you want to hear. And what they don't really want to tell you is, no, that idea is terrible. I'll never buy your product. It's much easier to say, yeah, well, yeah, that sounds interesting. Yeah, thank you. So what you're looking for is a strong statement of pain. I can give you an example. I had an amazing call with the founder of an ag startup a couple of weeks ago as I was preparing for this workshop. This very topic came up. The founder told a story that while they were doing customer discovery, they switched from one customer segment where there was some lukewarm interest to another segment. One of the first people they spoke with said, I want to buy your product now, and I want to invest in your company. Now, that's identified pain. I want to jump into the chat. Dave actually asked something really interesting, and I'm hoping we can get him to expand on that. He said, some ranchers don't know their pain around labor costs. And so this is a really good situation where people may not know where their pain is. And one of the tricks around customer discovery is whether it's possible to lead them down the path so they can understand their pain better. Dave, I wonder if you'd be willing to expand a little bit on what you wrote on the video. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you're willing. I think it's a great comment that you made.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfect, Dave. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we sell and lease drones to ranchers and feedlot operators. And part of the sales issue is that we're doing something entirely different than the way it's always been done. And they can't really appreciate, in part, how much time and money they'll save. I mean, it's like, you know, to some extent, it used to be landline phones. Now it's cell phones, or a lot of check writing. Now people just, send money by wire one way or another. And if they drill down and understand This is a big time saver and a big money saver.
I love to hear that, David, and it's such a great framing of the problem. In your own experiences, have you found ways to get ranchers to think about their labor costs in a way that they didn't before?
Well, that's an ongoing issue. I mean, there's different degrees of, I guess I'll say, accountant fluency or just appreciating that, you can't control the price of the cattle, but you can control your expenses. And this is one step to become more efficient. It's really an educational process to some extent based upon somebody's own natural inclinations and to some extent their age.
Yeah, again, I really like this framing in terms of the educational process. I mean, I think for me, one way I might go about it is trying to ask people how much they think about their labor costs and if they're concerned about labor costs changing or what proportion of their operational cost is their labor costs. And then if you get an answer that says, really, I don't know, we just pay them, there might be a way to dig down there. But it's really, that's a good, that's a tough customer discovery problem, and framing it as educational, I think, is a really good strategy. So Dave, thank you very much for sharing that. It's very much appreciated. We'll move now to the next point. Are you talking with the right person? So for many products, the user, the buyer, and the authorizer may be three different people. In agricultural settings, it's important to understand not only who's paying for your product or service, but who's influencing them in their purchase decisions. So I'm going to give you an example and we can discuss it. Let's say you're an animal health startup. Who's your buyer and who's your influencer? So you're selling products for animal health. So really two questions to answer in chat. Who's the buyer and who's the influencer? So when I say animal health, I mean livestock. Right, so in an animal health setting, the buyer is probably the livestock owner, the rancher. Who might the influencer be? Who might influence them in their decisions around health purchases? Yeah, exactly. The influencer might be the vet, the nutritionist, other family members that spend time with the animals. And so in this particular setting, when we've talked to animal health startups, one thing that they've told us is, well, we know that the buyer is the producer, but actually a lot of our customer discovery was spent with the vets and the nutrition advisors because they're the ones that make the decision. In other cases, we actually have some other answers here. We've had people say it might be the insurance company, it might be the government or the cattle buyer. So it's really important to understand for the particular product or service that you're providing, who's influencing the purchase decision, even if they're not paying for your good, because they're a key part of your customer discovery. And then finally, did you miss something important? So sometimes this question turns out to be the most important one. At the end of the interview, you should always ask, what have I missed? What should I have asked you? In my own experience, this question is often the one that leads to real learning and innovation. And you saw this approach being used in the last video we watched. So once you've finished an interview, customer discovery isn't over. It's important to be able to store and synthesize your key learning. First of all, the details behind a conversation fade fast. So write up your notes, comments, reflections, and next steps as soon as you can. This is already hard if you do it within 24 hours of the interview, and it just becomes harder with time. Note that some interviewers like to record interviews and some don't. And some interviewees don't mind recording and some do. Always check and let people know if you'd like to record a customer discovery interview, and be aware that in some contexts it will reduce the authenticity of the answers you get. For example, in my own experience, I've done a lot of customer discovery around regulatory non-compliance. And in my experience, I never record interviews when I'm in that realm, because having recording there will significantly change how people answer questions. Make sure that you do any follow-up you committed to in the interview and send a thank you. Bonus points for a written thank you note. Finally, customer discovery interviews are not intended to give you statistically significant data, but they should give you insights based on the patterns you see. They can be very tricky to interpret because what people say is not always what they do. You need to use your judgment to read between the lines, to try to understand the context and people's agendas, and to filter out biases based on the types of people you interview. But it is exactly the ability to use human judgment based on human connections that make interviews so much more useful than surveys. Steve Blank has a great example, coincidentally in ag tech, about the value of reflecting on what you've learned from your interviews. Let's watch.
So one of the key ideas about customer development is after you understood problem, customer solution, and you're now testing your solution, you're doing it with a series of what are called minimum viable products. And think of minimum viable products as small experiments that you're running in front of customers to elicit responses about whether they like the features, whether they're the right customers, whether you have product market fit, eventually about whether you have pricing, etc. But you're trying to use these MVPs to get learning. And if you're an engineer, the concept of MVPs sometimes seems so simple to you, you get it wrong. Because an MVP is not a smaller version or a defeatured version of the big product. The key insight is that minimum viable product, or MVP, is a shortcut to learning. Let's see a great example of what happens when we get the MVP wrong.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for taking this meeting.
Oh, great to meet with you, Dan.
So I'm working on a startup I'd like to tell you about.
Sure.
We're providing farmers with high precision imagery of their farmland so they can increase the yields on their farms. We're doing this by flying a drone with a hyperspectral camera over their farmland and giving them instantaneous feedback of what's really happening on the ground.
Well, that's exciting. How do you know farmers even care whether you do this?
So we've actually talked to hundreds of farmers and gotten
You did what?
We've talked to farmers.
Wow.
We really understand what they need and they're really excited about this product. So we think the next step is to build our first MVP and actually try it.
Great. What's the MVP?
We want to build one of the actual drones, put a hyperspectral camera on it, and run it for one farm.
I see. And how much is this going to cost?
So we need about $120,000 in seed.
So Dan, it seems to me that you did everything right until an MVP. Didn't you just tell me that the thing the farmers care about are the data?
Yeah, that's true.
Did they care about whether it came from a drone or an airplane, or are you putting the camera on a stick running across their fields?
No, they don't.
So if in fact, if the data isn't what they need, do you have a business?
No.
So don't you think the first thing you want to be testing is whether the data, regardless of how you put it together, is actually something that farmers would grab out of your hands, grab you by the collar and say, you're not leaving until I sign up for the service?
I guess you're right, yeah.
So my belief is the mistake you're making is the mistake all great engineers make, is thinking that the MVP is a smaller and quicker version of the final product. I'll contend in this case you want to shortcut the traditional MVP process and actually figure out if you're testing what the core of your business model is. Product market fit is not about the drone. Product market fit is about a class of farmers with high value crops with data that you think that's actionable for them. I'm guessing on fertilizer and diseases, etc. I'd be trying to figure out how to do that quickly. Can you imagine how you could do that?
We could rent a plane and fly over their land with a camera.
Okay. You could do that in a day, couldn't you?
Yeah, for a lot less than $120,000.
You might want to consider that.
Thanks.
That brings us to the end of the formal portion of our workshop. We're going to stick around now to answer any additional questions right now and to get your immediate feedback. Before we do that, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. This page links to some of the resources we used, as well as others. And we're happy to share those links with you after the seminar. If you have other questions, please let us know. We'd really love to hear whether you end up using anything you heard today in the coming months and years. If you do, please do let us know, as we'd love to learn what you did and how it went. We'd like to acknowledge the support of a grant from the Innovation Incubator, a clean tech incubator sponsored by Wells Fargo, as well as of our partners in that grant, Invest Nebraska. We'd also like to thank Sarah Bennett and the Nebraska Business Development Center for hosting us today. We're going to break our own rules and send you an email asking for feedback on this workshop, what was useful and what we should change or add to make it better. Please do take a few minutes and provide your honest feedback. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Just wanted to talk a little bit about the opportunities if you are pursuing SBIR funding, things that we have coming up. There is an SBIR 101 session on August 31st. So if you're not familiar with this program, we go through the program basics, how to identify appropriate topic areas, and how you want to, how to apply. SBIR and STTR week is occurring October 19th through the 23rd. So in this, you can meet one-on-one with program managers. All of this is being conducted virtually because of COVID-19. And so you'll be able to talk about your innovation and see if it meets with some of the solicitations through the various federal agencies. And then specifically for USDA, their deadline is coming up October 23rd. To find all of these opportunities and then the previous sessions that we've done through Nebraska Business Development Center, you can go ahead and follow the link that's there at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we just want to say thank you for joining us. To find out more about the Daugherty Water for Food Institute, their link is up there at the top, the waterforfood.nebraska.edu. They do a lot of tremendous work, really internationally, more than just the impact that's created within the state and within the United States. So thank you to Nick and to your team. We appreciate the opportunity to partner together on customer discovery. It's an important process in innovation. You want to make sure that folks are indeed wanting what you are creating. So thank you. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to help you further your innovation. Have a great day.